My remarks today really begin with the rudimentary proposition that every crisis in the reproduction of capital is simultaneously a crisis in the reproduction of labor power. And by labor power, I mean what Marx meant, the totality of human, bodily, corporeal, intellectual, social, and cultural capacities. But of course, this relationship between the crisis in the reproduction of capital and the crisis in the reproduction of labor power is always contradictory. They are dialectical doubles. And for capital, no crisis can be managed and overcome without reorganizing the production and reproduction of labor power, and more specifically, without the devaluation of labor power and the labors that reproduce it. These two are also inextricably connected, and the labors that reproduce it are both waged and unwaged. Very much like Kathy was saying towards the end of her comments, this is not exclusively about domestic labor when we talk about these reproductive labors, And as a result, the struggles to reorganize and devalue labor power are inherently involve those designed to resist that devaluation in all its forms. Yet, as a variety of feminist critics have noted, and I will refer here particularly to those who work within three different traditions, although frankly the categories here are highly porous, but essentially social reproduction feminism, materialist feminism, and Marxist feminism. And these are very porous. There's a lot of movement between these different positions. But what all of them have reminded us in different ways, there you go, is that Marx's account of labor power and its reproduction is dramatically and glaringly incomplete. It suffers from naturalism throughout, and yet I want to suggest to you that there are key nodal points in Marx's Capital in particular where we can glean directions and insights for how to overcome lapses, problems, contradictions within Marx's own texts in ways that perhaps he wouldn't himself have anticipated. And to that end, I want to spend a little bit of time working through three, what I'm calling nodal points in Capital. One is the account of labor power and its reproduction. The second is what Marx calls the capitalist law of population. And the third is the theory of primitive accumulation. And I want to suggest that there are ways of critically reworking these categories as we inherit them from Marx that I believe allows us to transcend a whole series of limitations within his own text, in a certain sense by entering, if you will, into the dialectical propulsion of the concepts and categories that he's using, even where his own text throws up a series of limits towards it. And I want to suggest that in doing this, we are better equipped to theorize gendered and racialized aspects of the crisis that we are living through, as well as specific generational aspects of it. Now, a pivotal moment in the drama of Capital, Volume 1, arrives when the commodity that sustains the entire system of surplus value production, human labor power, makes its appearance. Many readers have commented that we enter not only a new discursive terrain when labor power appears in the text, but we move much more dramatically into the social contestations that are inherent in the capitalist mode of production. And as our eyes turn to that special commodity, as Marx calls labor power, we discern a vital clue to the mysteries of capital, which is to say, only when an enormous mass of people are dispossessed of any other means of life and forced onto the labor market to seek those means by selling their laboring capacities can the systematic process of capital accumulation be launched. At this point in the text, having introduced labor power and identifying it as the hinge upon which the whole system turns, Marx then declares, we must now examine more closely this peculiar commodity, labor power. Like all others, it has a value. How is that value determined? And Marx's answer, I think, is demonstrably inadequate at this point. He says to us, for his maintenance, he requires a certain quantity of the means of subsistence. And frankly, left at that level, it completely desocializes the entire process of the production and reproduction of labor power. Labor power and its reproduction cannot be taken to be as simple as the existence of means of consumption or means of subsistence. Indeed, as soon as feminists working within a variety of materialist and Marxist traditions have done, as soon as we open up the problem, we quickly discover that labor power is unlike all other commodities in the following ways. First, it is not produced by capital. It is the only input into the capitalist production process that is systematically not produced by capital. Second, it therefore involves processes of reproduction that elude capital's control. Third, it involves biologically sex-specific and socially gender-specific processes. And four, labor power itself is intrinsically attached to subjectivity, both that of the products, the future labor powers, and the current labor powers that are being reproduced, and that of the producers and reproducers of labor power. As a result, for capital today or at any time to be engaged in processes of reorganizing the production and reproduction of labor power cannot be understood in terms of the general laws of commodity production per se. And on this, Marx's text is almost entirely silent. And that's something that I want to come back to momentarily. Moreover, I'll just remind you, as I said at the outset, that reorganizing the production and reproduction of labor power involves forms of social contestation unlike the problems of reproducing any other commodity. Now, Marx, of course, has to build some recognition of all of this into his theory, and he does it in the theory of wages. Still highly inadequate, but this is where he points to the problem, even though he is unable to see the problem all the way through. Which is to say that he recognizes that the value of labor power must be sufficient not only to produce today's laborers, but also the next generation. And he says this repeatedly in his theory of wages, that the owner of labor power is mortal, as he tells us, and the seller of labor power must perpetuate himself. But then he continues, in the way that every living individual perpetuates himself by procreation. And I think we would agree that at this point he has reverted to simple biology and is ignoring a whole gambit of wider social processes. Beyond procreation, Marx tells us essentially that when it comes to how the next generation of what he describes as the race of peculiar commodity owners, labor power, is birthed and raised, that capitalists may safely leave this to the workers' drive for self-preservation and propagation. Now, I want to suggest to you, and I'll spend a few minutes on this momentarily, that capital cannot leave it to these largely biological drives, however much Marx may have considered them socially organized. They could not then leave it to these drives, and they cannot now. In part because of reasons that we've already talked about, that the reproduction of labor power is a social process, not a merely natural one, and therefore it requires specific kinds of institutional sites and locations, the predominant one throughout the history of capitalism being kin-based units known as families. But also, in Marx's text, we encounter a problem that he does not recognize. And it is his claims there, and in a whole variety of other texts, that the working class family is disintegrating. Marx is convinced of this, and by the way, he sees both horrific and potentially emancipatory potential in this alleged disintegration of the working class family. But where he's clearly missed a crucial problem is that by naturalizing the reproduction of labor power, he has not asked, if the working class family disintegrates, in what social site will all of those human practices and labors involved in daily and generationally reproducing the working class occur? Where will they take place? If capital is not going to assume direct responsibility for them, how are they to be organized? How are they to be assured? And what we now know from the historical record is that because he didn't pose this problem, Marx was highly inattentive to all of those processes throughout the middle of the 19th century in Britain and the Victorian period, by which, through concerted legislative moves, the state specifically addressed this problem. The state intervened to deal with what was undoubtedly going to be a crisis in the reproduction of labor power in the medium to long term. I mean, consider that while Marx was working on capital, the average lifespan for a worker in Manchester was 30. That infant and child mortality rates, particularly in an era of intense child labor, that these infant mortality rates and child mortality rates were rising dramatically. Moreover, with more and more women and men working, it was true that the generational social reproduction of labor power was imperiled. And the state intervened in very deliberate and conscious ways to rebuild the working class family so as to ensure the continuation and the stability of the site for the reproduction of labor power. And so we get, really from the 1840s on in particular, in reports like the report of the Children's Employment Commission and the Coal Mines Regulation Act, a whole series of legislative moves designed to limit child labor, to limit women's labor, to introduce mandatory public schooling of children, to intervene by way of public health and the so-called child-saving movement. Fascinating, by the way, you analyze the child-saving movement, you really see in very graphic terms what Etienne Balibar describes as class racism. The treatment of the working class as an utterly other species. Long passages in some of these documents, in Scotland in particular, referring to these working class children as little Arabs in the streets and so on. I mean, the complete racialization of the working class as an other species. But the state undertook to counter infant and child mortality rates, to, quote, educate children in the skills, docility, and discipline appropriate to industrial capitalism, to reassert gender divisions of labor, to reinforce the identification of women with the domestic sphere. None of this was natural. It was socially organized, socially reconstructed, and socially reproduced. And as a result, across the Victorian era, the working class family was reconstituted by way of new restraints on female and child labor, a reinforced gender order, state responsibility for public education, health, and sanitation reform, and much of it promoted by way of a moral panic about the dirty, uncivilized working class hordes, about women at home and in the colonies, and about fear of transgressive working class women in particular. There's a wonderful amount that could be said, for example, about the campaigns to get women out of the coal mines, which, by the way, was not the most physically hazardous of the occupations in which women worked, but what was particularly offensive in the midst of this gender moral panic in the Victorian period was that these were women with trousers going into the bowels of the earth with these big old phallic symbols called shovels to dig coal and so on. And this, if you were going to reconstitute a gender order appropriate to women as domestic workers, this would not do. Now, as a result, something that Marx did not anticipate happened. The level of female employment stabilized and did not keep rising. the percentage of women in wage labor stabilized at around 25% in Britain. And this was, as I say, in significant measure deliberate social policy. And it tells us something very important before I turn to the next moment, which is that had Marx ever written the book on the state that was part of the 6-book plan for capital, would have ended with the book on the state and the book on the world market, I believe he would have logically have had to taken up themes such as these in order to theorize the ways in which the reproduction of labor power, the special commodity, is impossible on the basis of value logic alone. The laws of the capitalist market will not on their own produce labor power. In fact, they were destroying its reproduction. But beyond the book on the state, Marx's tendency to naturalize the reproduction of labor power also plays havoc with his account of the capitalist law of population, which is chapter 25 of volume 1. And I want to say a little bit about this and how I think it helps us understand the ways in which what Marx calls the primitive reproduction of capital is actually more central to the very dynamics of the system and to its inherent tendencies than he fully appreciates, although, as I'll try to show, I think Marx intuits some of this in his chapter, even if he doesn't see it all the way through. Now, what does Marx tell us? He sets out in chapter 25 what he calls the capitalist law of population. And the capitalist law of population says essentially this, that capital will always reproduce a reserve army of labor because of mechanization. Particularly if workers' wages start to rise, they will resort to mechanization, thereby displacing labor by means of production, restocking the industrial reserve army. And he tells us that this is a law of population peculiar to the capitalist mode of production. And he continues that the reproduction of this surplus population, he says, forms a disposable industrial reserve army which belongs to capital just as absolutely as if the latter had bred it at its own cost. But of course it hadn't, and it doesn't. It does not breed the surplus population at its own cost, and indeed, central to second wave feminism has been the struggle for reproductive choice, which, as we know, across the global north in particular, has produced lower birth rates, and as a result, rather than, as in Marx's day, the most capitalistically developed nations being exporters of surplus population, which of course is a pattern that we see in 19th century capitalism. Capitalism in the global north today is systematically an importer of surplus populations generated elsewhere within the world system. And this is precisely because the capitalist law of population, seen in purely national terms, is inadequate to the reproduction of the surplus labor section of the working class or the industrial reserve army. And what this means is that Marx's account of the capitalist law of population has to be supplemented by an account of primitive accumulation as a global process. And here I'm particularly taken by the fact that Marx seems to intuit part of this in the last parts of chapter 25 of Capital Volume 1. What's incredibly interesting is that he refers to section 5 as illustrations of the general law of capitalist accumulation. And then the last two sections are called, I know I can sound a little bit like a capital nerd when I do this, but then again, I am. Having said that,
why we love you.
Thank you. Section E is called, interestingly, the British agricultural proletariat. It doesn't actually fit his account of mechanization in industry. Section F is particularly interesting because it's called Ireland. And here Marx says, in concluding this section, we must travel for a moment to Ireland. Now, I think this is wonderful. And not only because Ireland's wonderful, but because he begins here to open up a whole line of theoretical explorations that he doesn't continue. But he tells us that Ireland is at present merely an agricultural district of England. He then raises a question which becomes crucial to the reproduction of labor in so much of the global south in the era of neoliberal globalization, remittances. And he talks about the remittances of Irish workers from America back to Ireland to allow the reproduction of workers at home. And then, quite appropriately, he takes good swipes at what he calls the national prejudices of the English towards the Irish. Now, what's fascinating to me about this is that Marx has brought into his illustrations of the general law of capitalist accumulation questions which properly, in terms of the theoretical structure he set out, don't belong there. These belong in the so-called Part 8 of the text. And yet he's brought into this discussion dispossession, displacement from the land, and colonialism. And I want to suggest to you that Marx's intuitions here are both right and profound, and they point the text in directions that he couldn't complete, in part, I believe, because the way in which he nationalized the account of reproduction and the capitalist law of population. Now, because I'm running out of time, I want to really just bring this back very briefly to the current moment and say that when we discuss today the struggles over the reproduction of labor power that are at the heart of the current crisis, we are talking about wage struggles and struggles over the social wage. We're talking about struggles over the human practices that are involved in social reproduction. And here it seems to me that four particular dimensions of the crisis stand out in very sharp relief. First, the way in which austerity so centrally involves an attack on working class women, both in terms of female employment in the public sector, which of course bears the brunt of state programs of austerity, but also in terms of privatization of reproduction and caring labor, and then of course the issues and problems of gender violence that every crisis escalates. Secondly, in terms of specific problems that confront workers of color, in situations where it is very typical that as job losses take place in the public sector, those who acquired jobs under equity and affirmative action hiring programs are among the first in very, very high proportions to lose those jobs. Thirdly, the question of youth, to which I won't be able to do justice right now, but simply to flag the generational reproduction of labor power which is happening right now is one in which young workers are being plunged into precarity on a massive scale. And I believe it's no accident that flashpoints of social struggle right now particularly include education in Chile, in Puerto Rico, in Mexico, or closest to where I live in Quebec. Mass strikes and struggles of young people over the questions of education, which is really about their generational reproduction. And fourthly, migrant workers and racialized precarity, because migrant workers have become the ideal flexible workers in the age of precariousness. Brought in on contracts, denied full rights, exportable and deportable at whim. And here I'll just conclude with a couple of quick comments about forms of struggle. And I want to just suggest to you, Sylvia, I think, quite appropriately talked about the Occupy movement, so I won't say anything about that. But I want to highlight something that I think on the radical left we need to be using as an example, and that's the recent Chicago teachers' strike. And I say that for several reasons. First, you have a workforce that's 87% female. A workforce that is about 50% African American and Latino. And how did they wage an effective strike? Because a group of left-oriented, rank-and-file activist teachers for years had done work in the communities beyond the workplace, fighting school closures in poor, working-class African American and Latino communities. They had years of working at this community level. And then when they won electoral leadership of their union, the Chicago Teachers Union, they had a social base for when they struck back against austerity, they could mobilize communities with them and alongside them. Communities of color, working class, and poor communities on a really significant level. And I believe that the way in which they did that, particularly on day 3 of their strike in Chicago, when at a whole number of schools, there were mass rallies of the community in solidarity with its predominantly female workforce, shows us something about what it means to link the struggles over social reproduction, and I'm just taking education as a site right now, in terms of both wage struggles and workplace struggles and the wider community struggles. And I think that we need to really begin to develop both our theoretical apparatus for understanding the struggles over social reproduction in this era of crisis and austerity, but also, of course, equally significantly, to begin to develop richer accounts of what successful resistance to austerity can look like, in which the struggles over social reproduction become central to our understanding of what we mean by class struggle today. Thank you.